I heard the shot before I felt it. That's the thing nobody tells you about being shot. There's a half second between the sound and the pain where your body hasn't caught up yet, where you're still running, still alive, still thinking you might make it. And then the mountain comes up to meet you. I hit the ground shoulder first on a rocky slope somewhere above the timberline. The cold came in next, not the cold of the air, but the cold that starts inside when the blood starts leaving. My father had described it once, from the war. You'll know it, he'd said, because it comes from the wrong direction. He was right. It did. I had enough time to think. I am 23 years old, and I am not going to die on a mountain for a man named Harlan Cole. And then the shadow fell over me, wide as a barn door, a voice behind it, low, rough, like the mountain itself had found a mouth. Don't move, you're losing blood. I looked up. The man standing over me was the largest human being I had ever seen, 6.5 feet of him blocking out what was left of the sky, built in a way that made the word man feel slightly inadequate. And he was looking down at me, not with concern, exactly, but with the calm assessment of someone totaling a column of numbers. There are men, I managed. They shot 3 of them, he said. They turned back at the ridge. How do you know? Because they know whose mountain this is. He crouched beside me, put one enormous hand against my shoulder, not gently, but precisely, with pressure that hurt and also, somehow, helped. I'm going to carry you. It'll hurt. I gathered. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile. What's your name? He said. Eliza Voss. Cord Callahan. He said it the same way he said everything else, flat, without apology, like a simple statement of fact. I knew that name. Every person in the Colorado Territory knew that name. I looked up at him from the cold ground with blood soaking through my coat and thought, I have survived one dangerous man today. I am not certain I have the energy for another. And then he lifted me, one arm, like I weighed nothing. And the trees started passing overhead, and the pain spiked white behind my eyes, and I stopped thinking about danger for a while. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I was not a foolish woman. I know that's what it sounds like, a woman alone, hired by strangers, riding into the mountains with men she barely knew. I understand how it sounds, but I need you to hold 2 things in your mind at once. I was not foolish, and I was desperate, and desperation makes the math look different. It makes a risk that a comfortable person would never take look like the only available road. So here is how I ended up on Cord Callahan's mountain. My father died in April, 4 months before I arrived in Pueblo. He left behind a leather-bound Bible, a watch that didn't run, and a debt to the First Federal Bank of St. Louis that consumed everything else before his body was cold. The house, the furniture, the horse. Gone. My father had been a practical man in most respects, but he had trusted the wrong people with his money, and it had cost us everything he'd spent 30 years building. I had a cousin in Pueblo, Margaret, who had written me letters for 2 years about the West. Come out, Eliza. There's work here. There's sky. A woman can build something real out here if she's willing to work for it. I had read those letters so many times the folds had gone soft. I booked passage on the first westbound stage I could afford. Margaret, as it turned out, had left Pueblo 3 months before I arrived. Her husband had followed a silver rumor north into Wyoming, and she'd gone with him. No forwarding address, no warning in the letter she'd apparently sent and I'd never received. I stood in Pueblo post office with my traveling bag and my $42 and the address of a cousin who no longer existed there, and I made the first of many practical decisions. I did not cry. Crying was for people who had somewhere to go after. I found work inside of 2 days, a boarding house run by a Mrs. Hooper, a sharp-eyed woman of 60 who paid fairly, asked almost no questions, and ran the cleanest kitchen I'd seen west of the Mississippi. I swept floors and made beds and served meals, and I was not proud of any of it in the way that pride is a luxury. But I was satisfied. I was building. Every dollar I saved was $1 toward the version of my life I was still going to have. It was in Mrs. Hooper's dining room on a Tuesday in late September that Harlan Cole walked in. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and he had the particular quality of a man who is accustomed to being taken seriously. He ordered his meal without looking at the menu, and he looked at me directly when he spoke, which was, I will say it plainly, rarer than it ought to have been in those days. He introduced himself as a land surveyor. He said he was heading north into the Black Ridge Range to map some property for a buyer back east. He said he needed a camp cook and manager for a 2-week expedition. The pay he named was 3 times what I made in a month at Mrs. Hooper's. I said yes. I said yes because the math said yes. I said yes because 2 weeks in the mountains with strangers was a calculable risk, and the reward was a financial cushion that would change the shape of my options considerably. I said yes because I was practical, not foolish. And practical people do not refuse an opportunity because it carries discomfort. I understood later, too late, but I did understand, that there is a category of risk that looks like a calculable number until the moment it doesn't. There were 4 of us when we rode out of Pueblo on a Wednesday morning: Harlan, his 2 men, a lean, quiet one named Dex, and a younger one they called Rabbit, who had the eyes of someone waiting for something to go wrong, and me. We rode north and east for 2 days. The land changed around us as we climbed, the flat scrub of the lower country giving way to pine-thick slopes, the air thinning and cooling, the sky growing taller. I cooked over campfires and kept my bedroll close, and I paid attention to things. What I noticed, Harlan never mentioned maps. In 2 full days of riding toward land he was supposedly surveying, he never once pulled out any surveying equipment, never once paused on a ridge to look at the terrain with the particular focused attention of a man whose profession requires him to understand what he's looking at. He looked at the land the way a different kind of man looks at it, as cover, as distance, as the space between here and the place he needed to get to. What I noticed, the way Dex and Rabbit checked behind them on the trail, not constantly, not the nervous checking of men who expected pursuit, the calm, habitual checking of men who had learned to do it so thoroughly it no longer looked like fear. What I noticed, the way they talked to each other, not in any kind of obvious code, nothing so dramatic, just ordinary words in ordinary combinations that landed slightly wrong. The package should be rested by Thursday. The delivery point is sheltered from the north, words that meant nothing and everything. The second night was the one that decided me. We made camp in a hollow below a granite outcropping, pine-sheltered, the fire kept small the way Harlan preferred, low enough that it threw heat but not much light. I made supper, salt pork and hardtack and dried apples, the kind of meal that keeps you alive without requiring you to care about it. Dex ate without looking at anything. Rabbit ate too fast, the way nervous men do, like the food might be taken before he finished it. Harlan ate slowly and watched me. I had noticed this over the 2 days of riding, the way his attention returned to me at intervals, not with any obvious intent, just the checking of a man who has something he needs to keep track of, a tool, a liability. I was still working out which. After supper, when Dex and Rabbit had pulled their bedrolls to the far side of the fire, Harlan sat across from me and said, "You're a careful woman, Miss Voss." "I try to be," I said. "You notice things." He said it pleasantly, the way you say something that isn't quite a compliment. "I worked a boarding house for 6 months," I said. "You learn to read a room." He smiled at that. It was a good smile, practiced, warm, the kind that arrives at exactly the right moment. "And what does this room tell you?" I looked at the fire. "That you gentlemen are not surveyors," I said, "and that you knew that when you hired me. A silence, not uncomfortable. He let silence do work, I'd noticed, let it sit between things and see what the other person did with it. And yet, here you are, he said. Here I am, I agreed. I needed the work. You needed a cook. I met his eyes across the fire. I don't require explanations for the things that aren't my business. He studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded, once as if I'd passed something. Good, he said. That's a sensible arrangement. I went to sleep telling myself it was. I woke at 2 a.m. from a dream I couldn't remember and lay in the dark and listened to the mountain and understood that whatever arrangement I'd made at the fire, sensible was not the word for it. By the second night I was frightened. By the morning of the third day I had made up my mind. I rose before dawn, dressed in the dark, rolled my bedroll as quietly as anything I've ever done in my life. I was 3 steps toward the horses when Harlan Cole's voice came out of the darkness like something that had been waiting there. Where are you going, Miss Voss? He was sitting by the dead fire. Had been sitting there, I realized, watching the direction of my bedroll, possibly all night. The gray pre-dawn light made his face look like something carved from the same stone as the mountains. I've decided this arrangement isn't suited to me, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I'll return the advance. I don't think, Harlan Cole said, standing slowly. That's how this works. I'm not a prisoner. No, he said. You're a witness. I ran. I made it further than I had any right to expect. 50 yards, 60, scrambling upslope in the dark between the pines, branches tearing at my coat and my hair, my lungs burning in the thin mountain air. I could hear Dex behind me, faster than he looked, quieter than a man his size had any right to be. Then the shot, then the fire in my shoulder, then the ground. I woke up warm. That was the first wrong thing. Wrong, because the last thing I remembered was cold, a cold that had gotten inside my coat and inside my chest and was moving inward, the kind of cold that is working toward something. I was on a cot, narrow, real, with the weight of wool blankets over me and a fire burning somewhere nearby. I could hear it, the slow crackle of it, and see the orange light it threw across a low log ceiling. I turned my head carefully. One room. Log walls. A packed earth floor covered in patches with animal hides, thick and dark. A fireplace large enough to roast a whole animal, currently hosting a fire of moderate ambition. Shelves along one wall holding tin cups, tools, boxes I couldn't identify. A door, heavy and fitted close into its frame, closed and, I squinted, barred from the inside. A window, small and high, showing darkness still. And in the single chair by the fire, completely still, sat Cord Callahan. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the fire with his elbows. On his knees and his hands loose between them, and in the firelight, he looked almost peaceful, wasn't the word exactly. He looked the way very large, very capable things sometimes look when they have decided, for the moment, not to move, like a mountain deciding not to have an avalanche. I watched him for a moment before I said anything, because there was information in watching him before he knew I was watching. What I saw, a man who had learned to be still the way most people learn to breathe. Automatic. Necessary. A thing you do so long you stop knowing you're doing it. I also saw the wanted poster on the back of the door. From this distance I couldn't read it, but I knew the shape of one. I had seen them in Pueblo, the rough printed portrait, the block letters, the number at the bottom. You're awake, he said, without turning. How did you know? Your breathing changed. He looked at me then. Those pale eyes, blue worn down to almost nothing by sun and altitude, took stock of me in a way that felt like inventory. How's the shoulder? Functional, I said, which was optimistic but not dishonest. You stitched it. Bullet went through. Lucky part. He stood, The room seemed to rearrange itself to accommodate the height of him, and moved to the fire, lifting a tin cup from the shelf. "You need to drink something." He brought the cup to me. I sat up slowly, careful of the shoulder, and took it. Tea of some kind, bitter and hot and tasting of something medicinal underneath. "Thank you," I said. "I mean that seriously." He looked at me from his considerable height with an expression I couldn't parse. "The wanted poster on your door," I said. "That's you." "Yes." $500. "Last I checked." He went back to his chair. "The number's probably changed. It's been a while since I've been to town to look." I absorbed this. Outside the cabin, the wind was up. A high sound against the logs, the sound of altitude and isolation. I looked at my hands around the tin cup and thought carefully about what kind of man I was now dependent on for my survival and what kind of choices I had available. "The men who shot me," I said. "Harlan Cole's outfit, are they still on the mountain?" "For now." He said it the way he said most things, as a simple condition of the landscape already accounted for. They won't come near the cabin. "You said that before. Whose mountain this is?" "I did." "What does that mean, exactly?" He looked at the fire for a moment. "It means I've been here 4 years and I've had the same conversation with various interested parties multiple times, and the conversation ends the same way each time, and word gets around." I looked at him. "How does the conversation end?" "With them leaving," he said, "one way or another." I drank my tea. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind went high and then low again, and somewhere beyond the log walls, the mountain settled into whatever the mountains do when they are deciding about the night. I needed to leave. I understood that. As soon as my shoulder would allow it, I needed to get down off this mountain and back to the world of towns and post offices and Mrs. Hooper's dining room and the small, ordinary life I had been building. I needed to put Cord Callahan and his one-room cabin and his pale, exhausted eyes behind me. I understood all of that. I also understood that I was, for the moment, entirely at his mercy. "You should sleep," he said, not looking at me. "I've been asleep. You've been unconscious. That's different." He reached to the shelf beside him and picked up a book without looking at it. Habit, the gesture of someone who reads the same book so often they know where each one lives by feel. Sleep. I looked at the book in his hands, worn nearly to pieces, the spine cracked white. I couldn't see the title from the cot. "What are you reading?" I asked. A pause. He turned the book so I could see the cover. Tennyson. Selected Poems. The most unlikely book I could have imagined in the hands of the most feared man in the Colorado Territory. I lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and thought about that for a long time before sleep took me again. Over the next several days, I learned Cord Callahan the way you learn a place, by observation, by moving through it carefully, by paying attention to what it shows you and what it doesn't. He rose before dawn every day, gone for an hour or more before I woke, always returned with a rifle slung on his back and the specific settled quality of a man who has confirmed that the perimeter is intact. He never said where he went. I never asked. Some arrangements are made without words. He cooked simply the way a man cooks who has been feeding himself alone for a long time. Cornmeal, dried meat, whatever the mountain offered. He brought a rabbit one morning and prepared it with an efficiency that answered certain questions about his history without requiring him to speak. He did not waste anything. He did not make anything more complicated than it needed to be. He did not talk much. When he talked, he was direct in a way that took some getting used to. No social softening, no conversational filler. He said what he meant and meant what he said and left everything else in silence. At first, this felt like distance. Later, I understood it differently. Some people use words to fill space. Cord used them only to mean things. He slept on the floor. I didn't realize this until the second morning, when I noticed the second cot rolled and stored beneath mine. He had given me the only sleeping surface in the cabin without mentioning it, without making it a thing. When I pointed this out, he looked at me with that flat expression and said, "You needed it more." And that was the end of it. He read every night, always the Tennyson. He held the book near the fire, and I watched his face when he read, not obviously from the corner of my vision. And what I saw there was the only time his face was unguarded. Not soft exactly, but open in a way it wasn't the rest of the time, like the words made space inside him for something the rest of the day didn't allow. I wanted to ask him about it. I didn't those first days, but I thought about it. On the third day, I was well enough to sit up without the room listing. On the fourth, I could stand. On the fifth, I was moving around the cabin, testing my shoulder in slow increments, watching the way the morning light came through the single small window and fell across the floor. That was also the day we had our first argument. It started over nothing, or rather, it started over water. I had carried the basin outside to dump it and refill it from the creek runoff barrel because it needed doing, and I was well enough and I did not like sitting idle. And he came around the corner of the cabin and looked at me with that particular expression he had that was not quite anger, but was in the same family. "You'll tear the stitching," he said. "I haven't. You will." He crossed to me and took the basin from my hands in one motion, not rough but not asking either, and set it on the barrel himself. "Go inside." Something in me went very still. I had been told what to do by men who meant something different by it, and I had learned the difference between the varieties, and I understood that this was not that kind. But it was still a man telling me what to do in a tone that expected compliance. "I am capable of carrying a basin," I said. "Your shoulder, my shoulder is mine to manage." He looked at me. I looked at him. The mountain went on around us, indifferent. "You're a guest here," he said. "I'm not a guest," I said. "I'm a woman who was shot and carried here and has been sleeping in your bed for 5 days while you sleep on the floor, and I am not going to add being waited on to the list of things I owe you." A pause. Something moved in his face that I couldn't read. "I don't think of it as a debt," he said, quieter. "I know you don't." I held his gaze. "That's exactly why I do." I took the basin back from the barrel. "I will be careful with the shoulder. I promise you that." He watched me carry it inside, said nothing more. But that evening, when I came back from the outhouse, there was a second barrel of clean water standing beside the door, full to the rim, which he had clearly refilled and moved without mentioning. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went inside and sat down and didn't say anything about it, and neither did he, and we ate supper in the particular silence of two people who have both made their point and are letting it rest. That was the morning he came back from his rounds, and found me looking at the wanted poster. I had taken it down from the back of the door carefully. It was nailed but lightly, and unfolded it. The drawing looked something like him, the jaw, the brow, the particular width of the shoulders. But it was flat, two-dimensional in a way that missed entirely the quality that filled a room when he walked into it. "Cord Callahan," it said, "wanted for robbery and murder in the territories of Colorado and New Mexico. $500, reward, dead or alive." He came through the door and stopped, saw me with the poster in my hands, said nothing. I looked at him. "Robbery and murder. That's what it says. Is it true?" A pause. He hung his rifle on the hooks by the door. The hooks I'd noticed were always empty when he left, always full when he came back. He moved to the fire and crouched beside it without answering. "Cord." He looked at me over his shoulder. "Why does it matter?" "Because you could have left me on the slope, and you didn't. Because I'm living in your cabin eating your food, and I'd like to know what kind of man I'm beholden to." The fire shifted. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might simply choose not to answer at all. And I had begun to understand that was something he would do, that silence for him was not evasion, but a kind of answer itself. Then, "The robbery is true," he said. "After a fashion, I took something back that was taken from me first. Whether that counts depends on who's writing the law." "And the murder?" He looked at the fire for a long time. "Not today," he said. It was said without harshness, just a door, closing. I understood it for what it was, not refusal, but weight. Some things cost too much to give to a near stranger over a tin cup. "All right," I said. He glanced at me over his shoulder, briefly, as if checking whether I meant it. I held his gaze until he looked away. He took the poster and nailed it back on the door without looking at it, with the precision of habit, the nail finding its hole without needing to search. And I understood then that it wasn't a reminder to himself of what he was. It was a warning to anyone who came in the door. This is what they say about me. I know what they say. Come in knowing it. I folded that understanding away with everything else I was learning about him. On the 6th day, I cooked breakfast. He was outside when I did it. Nothing elaborate, just the cornmeal and dried meat, the way he made it, with a little more salt than he used, and the meat broken smaller so it distributed better. When he came in and found the food already made, he stopped in the doorway for a moment. Something moved through his face that I was learning to read, that brief door opening and closing that was the most expression he allowed himself most of the time. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to be useful." I handed him his plate and sat down across from him with my own. I don't do well with being kept. He sat, ate, I ate. The silence between us was different from the silences of the first days. Those had been the silence of two people being careful. This was something else, easier. Like two people who had agreed, without discussing it, on a certain level of honesty. "How long until you can ride?" he asked. "A week, maybe less if the shoulder keeps." He nodded. "After that I'll need to get somewhere. A town." "Carrion Creek," he said. 3 days south. Small. Rough. Functional. I'll head there. I have 2 horses. You can take the bay." I looked at him. "I can't take your horse." "You can pay it back." He shrugged, a whole weather system shifting. "Or not." "Why would you?" "Because you're going to need it more than I will." He said it the same way he said everything, like it was arithmetic. I looked at him across the table in the thin morning light and thought about what it cost a man accustomed to being entirely alone to simply say, "Because you need it. Not I have extra, or it's no matter, just because you need it." "Cord," I said carefully, "what happened to you before the mountains? I'm not asking about Cole or the law. I'm asking about you, what you were before all of this." He looked at his plate for a moment. A man with a ranch and a family, and about 7 years of believing that working hard for something was enough to keep it. He picked up his fork. Turned out that was wrong. "And now?" He looked up at me. "Now I'm something else." "What?" A pause. "I don't have a word for it yet." I held his gaze for a moment. "I think," I said slowly, "that you're a man who's been alone so long, you've started to think you're something other than a man." He went very still. "And I think," I said, "that you're not." The fire made its low sound. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines with its cold, constant voice. He looked at me for a long time with those pale, sun-bleached eyes, and I could not tell, could not read what was happening behind them. Then he looked back at his plate. "Eat your breakfast," he said. I ate my breakfast. But something had shifted in the room, subtle as a change of wind direction. I felt it, and I did not examine it too closely. Not yet. It was the 7th day when everything changed, though not the way I expected. I had spent the afternoon outside, my first real time in the mountain air, my shoulder well enough for slow movement. Sitting on the flat rock in front of the cabin, watching the way the late light moved down the slopes, turning the pine dark green, first gold, and then orange, and then a deep bronze that made the whole mountain look like it was lit from inside. I was thinking about Carrion Creek, about the boarding house I would find there, the work, the resumption of the life I'd interrupted by getting shot. I was thinking about it the way you think about something you know you need and aren't entirely sure you want. I heard him coming before I saw him, that long stride of his, moving fast, the sound of dead needles underfoot. I looked up. He came around the north side of the cabin, and there was blood on his hands, and his jaw was set in a way I hadn't seen before, and his eyes, when they found mine, were not the pale, quiet blue of the evenings. They were something else, something that had been waiting behind the quiet blue for a long time. "Inside," he said. "What happened inside?" The word landed like a fist on a table, not raised, not angry in the way anger is raised voices and red faces, controlled, which was, I understood in that moment, significantly more alarming. I went inside. He came in behind me and barred the door and went to the basin and washed his hands. The water went pink. He dried them without looking at me and went to the shelf and stood with his back to me for a long moment. "Cord. Cole sent a man," he said, still not turning, "to scout the eastern approach." A pause. "He won't be scouting anymore." "Is he dead?" "No." A beat. "But he won't forget the conversation." I sat down at the table. In the low cabin light, I could see the set of his shoulders, the tension across them, the deliberate steadiness of a man bringing himself back from something. He turned around, and the eyes were calmer now, the pale blue returning, but underneath the calm I could still see the other thing. The thing that had made 8 men worth of enemies and a $500 reward, and 4 years alone on a mountain that everyone who knew his name avoided. I should have been frightened. I was. A little. Honest answer, a little. But I had also spent 7 days watching this man sleep on the floor so I could have the cot. Watching him heat water so my shoulder would be warm when I cleaned it. Watching him hold a worn-to-pieces book of poetry like it was something precious. And what I understood, in the particular clarity of that moment, was that what I was seeing now, the controlled danger, the coiled stillness, the capability for something I would rather not name explicitly, was not separate from those other things. It was the same man, the whole man. The danger and the care were not opposites. They were parts of the same thing. I stood up and crossed to the shelf where he was standing. He watched me approach with a wariness that was its own kind of information, a man who expected people to back away. "Sit down," I said. "Let me look at your hands." "They're fine. They're cut. Sit down." He sat. I got the cloth and the tincture he'd used on my shoulder, and I cleaned the cuts on his knuckles, 2 on the right hand, 1 on the left, without saying anything. He sat still under my hands with that absolute stillness he had, and I worked carefully, and didn't look up at his face. "You could have told me about the scout without showing me that," I said quietly. "Showing you what?" "What you look like when you've just hurt someone." I set down the cloth. "I'm not saying I blame you for it. I understand why. I'm saying I see it, and I'm not going anywhere." A long pause. "You should be." "Probably." I looked up at him then. From this close, the height of him was more apparent. I had to angle my head back to meet his eyes, but I've found that should and will are different calculations. He held my gaze for a long moment, then, quietly, "You're not frightened of me. I told you before, I'm a little frightened of you. You're treating my hands. Frightened people can still be useful." I stepped back. "The cuts aren't deep. They'll be fine." He looked at his hands, then at me. "Miss Voss," he said. "Eliza." The correction, soft. "Why are you still here?" It was the first time he'd asked it directly. I'd been asking myself the same question for 3 days. "Where else would I be?" I said. And that wasn't an answer. We both knew it wasn't an answer. But he looked at me for another moment, and then away, and neither of us pushed it further. The fire made its low sound. Then, after a long silence, he said, "The murder." I looked up. He was still looking at the fire. His jaw was set, not the controlled danger set from earlier. Something different. The set of a man opening something he has kept closed for a long time and is not entirely certain he should. "3 men came to my ranch outside Taos," he said. 5 years ago. A debt my brother had put my name on without my knowing. When I told them the debt wasn't mine, when I showed them proof it wasn't mine, they decided to make an example anyway." He paused. "My wife's name was Clara. My son was 14 months old. The fire was the only sound in the cabin. The law decided I was the problem," he said. "Easier than explaining what happened. The men who came had connections. I didn't." He finally looked at me. "The 3 men I killed afterward, those I don't apologize for. The law can call it what it wants." I held his gaze. "I'm not the law." "No," he said. "You're not." Something passed between us in the silence. Not absolution. I wasn't in a position to give that, and he wasn't asking for it. Something more honest than that. Recognition. The kind that passes between people who have both been broken by things that weren't fair and kept moving anyway. "Thank you," I said, "for telling me." He looked away, looked at his hands, then back at the fire. "Go to sleep, Eliza," he said, quietly. I went to sleep. On the 8th day, I decided to go. Not because of the night before, not because of anything he'd done, but because I woke up that morning and lay in the gray, pre-dawn dark of the cabin, listening to his slow breathing from the floor where he slept, and thought, I am not leaving because I need to. I am staying because I want to. And that is a different thing, and it frightens me more than he does. I had come west with plans. I had come west because the east had taken everything, and the west had space in it, and space meant possibility. And possibility was the only thing I had left. My plan had been work, save, build, stay practical, stay moving, stay inside the arithmetic of survival, and not let anything get bigger than that arithmetic. Cord Callahan was not inside that arithmetic. So I got up before he woke. I dressed quietly. I rolled my pack. I went to where the horses were stalled on the north side of the cabin, and I began to saddle the bay, the horse he had offered me, the one he said I could take, and I worked steadily, and I told myself I was being practical. The bay shifted under my hands, patient. The mountain was cold and quiet. The sky to the east was beginning to gray. I had the saddle cinched and the pack tied and my foot in the stirrup when I stopped. No, that is the shorter version. The truer version is this. I put my foot in the stirrup and I swung up and I rode. Not far. The trail south dropped away from the cabin through the pines, and I took it at a walk, the bay moving under me with that patient competence of a horse who has made many trails and considers this one no more difficult than any other. The cold was genuine and sharp. My shoulder ached with the movement, and I ignored it. I watched the pines thin on either side and the trail open out ahead of me, heading down and south toward 3 days of riding and Carrion Creek and the resumption of everything I had planned. I rode maybe 50 yards. The trail bent around a granite shoulder, and the cabin disappeared from sight behind me, and suddenly there was nothing in my field of vision except mountain, the long sweep of the slope below, the gray morning sky above, the pines going dark and deep on both sides. And it was beautiful and enormous and completely empty, and I sat on the bay in the middle of it, and I understood something I had been avoiding understanding. I was not leaving because I was finished here. I was leaving because I was frightened of what staying meant. And that was a different thing. That was not practicality, that was retreat. My father had told me once, I was 11, and something at school had frightened me into staying home. He'd said, "Eliza, there are two kinds of leaving. There's the kind where you've finished with a place, and there's the kind where the place isn't finished with you yet." He'd sent me back to school. I'd been angry about it for a week and grateful for it for the rest of my life. I sat on the bay on the silent trail and thought about that. Then I turned her around. I rode back up the slope and unsaddled her and put her feet in the trough and stood in the cold with my hand on her flank for a moment before I went back inside. I told myself it was because my shoulder wasn't sound enough yet. It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the truth either, and I was honest enough with myself to know the difference. I went back inside. He wasn't awake yet. I put the kettle on the fire and sat at the table, and by the time the water was boiling, I had accepted the thing I'd been trying to outride. I was not leaving, not yet. And the reason was not the shoulder. He came in from his morning rounds to find me at the table with coffee. He stopped in the doorway. "I thought you were leaving today," he said. "I was." He waited. "My shoulder isn't ready," I said. He looked at me for a long moment with those pale eyes. He knew it wasn't the shoulder. I knew that he knew. Neither of us said so. "A few more days then," he said. "Yes." He came inside and poured his own coffee and sat across from me, and we drank in silence, in the morning light. And it was the most honest conversation I'd ever had without either of us saying anything. The tension spike happened on the 9th day without warning, the way the mountain did most things. I was outside, further from the cabin than I'd been yet, my shoulder finally allowing me real movement, real air, walking the eastern edge of the flat shelf of rock above the cabin where the view opened out to 100 miles of territory in every direction. The scale of it still surprised me. You do not understand the West until you're somewhere high enough to see it properly, and then it is almost too much to hold in your mind at once. Ridge after ridge of dark pine, the distant silver thread of a river valley, the great gray wall of the higher peaks to the northwest with their early snow. I was standing at the edge of this looking at all of it when I heard the voices, two of them, below and to the east, coming up through the trees on the slope below the shelf, moving without particular caution, which meant either they didn't know anyone was up here or they didn't care. I moved back from the edge immediately, looked toward the cabin, 200 yards behind me, blocked from this angle by a rock formation. Cord was inside, or had been when I left. The voices came closer. I pressed myself back against the rock formation and tried to think. I could run for the cabin, but running on an open shelf of rock would put me in plain sight of whoever was coming up the slope before I made the tree line. I could stay where I was. I could... One of them laughed. It was a specific kind of laugh, the kind that belongs to men who are certain of their position. I had heard that laugh before, in the pre-dawn dark of a campsite 3 days from Pueblo. Rabbit. Cole had sent at least 2 men this time. I heard the crack of a boot on a loose stone, close 30 yards below the lip of the shelf. And then nothing, the specific quality of nothing. That meant they had stopped moving. Listening. I held my breath. Then, from the trees to my left, a sound that was not a sound, a presence, something large, moving with absolute silence through the pines, and I turned my head, and Cord came out of the shadows between the trees with his rifle, and his eyes already on the slope below, and his face entirely empty of anything except the calculation I'd seen in it that first morning when he'd looked at me on the ground and assessed what needed doing. He looked at me, put one finger to his lips. I nodded. He moved to the edge, not a quick movement, but a precise one, low to the rock, finding the angle that let him see the slope below without being seen from it. He looked for 3 seconds. Then he stood up to his full height, in plain view, and spoke in a voice that carried down the slope like a stone dropped in still water. "I know you're there," he said. "Both of you. You've got about 30 seconds to decide if this ridge is worth dying on." More silence. Then, faintly, the sound of movement. retreating, stumbling slightly, back down the slope the way they'd come, faster than they'd arrived. He watched until the sound was gone. Then he turned and looked at me. His face was still that emptied-out calculation, but something in it changed when he found me pressed against the rock, something that might have been relief, if relief looked like a mountain briefly considering not being a mountain. "You should have gone back to the cabin," he said. "There wasn't time." There was time. I didn't know how much time there was. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he crossed to where I was standing and, not roughly, but without asking, took my arm and steered me back toward the tree line in the cabin. The grip of his hand was warm through my coat sleeve, enormous and warm and very, very careful. "Next time," he said, "you go to the cabin." "Next time." I said, "Let's hope there isn't one." Something moved in his jaw that I'd learned to read as the shape his face made when it was deciding against a smile. That night, after supper, he said, "Cole is running out of men willing to come up here." "Good. He'll come himself eventually. When he does, there won't be a conversation." I looked at him. "What will there be?" "An ending." He said it the same way he'd say rain or morning. "And then?" He was quiet. "Cord. After Cole? What do you do? You stay here forever?" "I've been here 4 years." "That's not an answer." He looked at the fire. A long time. Long enough that the fire shifted and resettled. "I've been here 4 years," he said again, slower. "And in 4 years I haven't had a reason to think about after." I let that sit. "And now?" I said. He looked at me. The fire threw its orange light across half his face and left the other half in shadow, and his eyes were that particular pale blue that I had decided was the color of a man who had been looking at mountains for so long the color had gotten into him. "And now I'm thinking about it," he said. I held his gaze, didn't speak. "Stay," he said. "A few more days until Cole is dealt with." A pause. "After that," he stopped. "After that we can talk about after." "We've never talked about anything," I said. "Not directly." "No. We've talked around things." "Yes. So say it directly." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked. Outside, the mountain wind moved and moved. "I don't want you to go," he said. "That's the direct version." "I know," I said. "I don't want to go." A beat. "That's mine." He held my gaze. Something in his face shifted, not opening exactly, more like the moment before a door opens when you can see the light coming through the gap. Something that had been very tightly managed for a very long time. "Eliza," he said. My name. Low, careful, like something he was testing the weight of. "Cord." "A few more days," he said. "More than a few," I said. And that was all. And that was enough. We both knew Cole was coming the next day. Cord said it that evening, plainly, in the way he said most things. He'd been up to the lookout before supper and come back with the specific settled quality that meant he'd seen something and was now doing arithmetic. He sat down at the table and looked at his hands for a moment. "He'll come in the morning," he said, "from the south approach, alone or close to it." "How do you know?" "Because that's what I'd do." He looked up. "It's what you do when you're out of other options, and you've decided the direct way is the only one left." I set down the spoon I was holding. Outside, the wind had come up, the high, cold sound of it against the logs, the sound I'd grown familiar enough with to parse. This was the overnight wind, the one that came off the upper peaks after dark and ran down the slopes until morning. "Are you afraid?" I asked. He considered this with the seriousness he gave to direct questions. "No," he said. "Cole's a careful man, but he's not a dangerous one. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Dangerous men don't need to plan, they just move." He turned his cup in his hands. "Cole plans. That means he's calculating odds, and his odds are very poor at this point." I looked at him. In the firelight, he was all planes and shadow, the size of him filling the far side of the table the way it always did. The simple physical fact of him that I had stopped noticing except in moments like this one, when I stepped outside of the ordinary and saw it freshly. "What happens after?" I said. "After Cole." He looked at me. "We talked about this." "We talked around it," I said. "You said we'd talk about after. This is after." A pause. The fire settled. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about whether a man with a price on his head can build something, whether that's possible, whether the roof of a thing like that is solid or whether it's always waiting to come down." "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think it depends on who else is holding it up." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved and moved. Somewhere on the mountain, something shifted. A branch, a rock, the mountain settling into its night. And the sound of it was swallowed by the dark and the wind and the wide indifferent sky. "I have $40 and some change," he said finally. "The roan horse besides the bay. Some tools. This cabin." A pause. "That's what I have." "That's more than I had when I came west," I said. Something moved in his face. Not the almost smile. Something quieter than that. More considered. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we'll want clear heads." "Cord." He looked at me. "We're going to be all right," I said. It was a presumptuous thing to say. We, as if it were already decided, as if the word were not doing a great deal of work in that sentence. He looked at me for a long moment with those pale, worn-down eyes, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it. "Go to sleep," he said. I went to sleep. But I lay in the dark for a long time first, listening to the wind and the fire and his slow, steady breathing from the floor below me, and I thought, yes, we are. Harlan Cole came on the 10th day. He came alone. And the fact that he came alone told me almost everything about how badly things had gone for him. 4 men sent up the mountain. None of them had come back with anything useful. The one Cord had caught on the eastern slope. The 2 from the ridge, the original scout. All of them had come back with either injuries or a convincing absence of willingness to try again. So he came himself. In the early morning, when the light was flat and gray and the mountain was as quiet as it ever got. Cord was up at the lookout. He was always up at the lookout in the early morning. And he came back down at a pace that made me set down what I was doing before he spoke. "Cole?" he said. I stood up. "Stay." "Don't say stay in the cabin." A pause. Something moved in his face. "Stay close to me." We went out together. Cole was standing at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 50 yards from the cabin door. He was wearing the same good coat I remembered from Pueblo, now trail-worn and dusty, and he looked smaller than I remembered. Context, I thought. He'd been a large presence in Mrs. Hooper's dining room in the way that men who carry their own authority tend to be. Here, 50 yards from Cord Callahan on Cord Callahan's mountain, he was simply a man. He looked at me, then at Cord. Something moved through his face, calculation, and below the calculation, something older. Something that might have been, if he was the kind of man who had it, shame. "Miss Voss," he said, "you look better than I expected." "Mr. Cole." I held his gaze. "You look worse." His jaw shifted. He looked at Cord. "Callahan, I'm not here for a fight." "Then you've already won something," Cord said. "I want the woman. I'll ride out and this is finished." "That's not how this works," Cord said, quietly. The same words Cole had said to me in the pre-dawn dark of that campsite, the same flatness. I saw Cole register it. "She's a witness to what?" I stepped forward. I'd been thinking about this for days, turning it over, finding the angles. "I didn't see anything, Mr. Cole. I heard an implication, nothing more. A woman who was frightened misread a conversation and ran and got herself shot for her trouble. That's the story if I tell it. I held his eyes. I'm not interested in whatever you were doing up here. I was never interested. I wanted a job and I wanted to go home afterward. That's all I wanted. He studied me. You expect me to take that on faith? I expect you to take it as the best available offer, I said, and to think about what happens if you push for something else. He was quiet. His eyes moved to Cord, who was standing completely still. That particular stillness of his, not aggressive, not posturing, just present, the way a wall is present. And then back to me. We were running guns, he said finally, flatly. Army surplus, buyers up north who shouldn't have them. A pause. That's what I needed you not to testify to. I won't testify to anything, I said. There's nothing to testify to. I don't know anything and I didn't see anything and I have no interest in anything except my own life. A long silence. The mountain breathed around us. A wind moved through the upper pines, high and cold, and then settled. Harlan Cole looked at me for a moment that I could not read entirely. Then he looked at Cord one last time, at the size of him, at the stillness, at whatever it was that the most feared man in the territory wore on his face when he was waiting for something to end. And he made a decision. He turned and walked back into the trees. We stood there until his horse's hoofbeats faded, heading south and then southeast, moving away and getting smaller, and then gone. Cord let out a breath, slight, controlled. You've been thinking about that speech for a while, he said. 4 days, I said. It was the right call. I know. I turned to look up at him. I wanted a life, not justice. Justice is a luxury for people who have more to spend than I do. He looked at me for a long moment. I know that calculation, he said quietly. I know you do. Something passed between us. The kind of thing that passes between people who have survived. Something together. Not gratitude, exactly. Not relief. Something quieter and more permanent. He reached out and, slowly, deliberately, giving me every chance to step back, put his hand against the side of my face. His palm was warm and rough and enormous, and he held it there for just a moment, looking at me with those pale, worn-down eyes. Then he dropped his hand, turned back toward the cabin. Come inside, he said. It's cold. I followed him. The mountains settled around us into its morning stillness. The story was not over, but the worst of it was done. I stayed through the winter. I want to be clear about something. There was nothing keeping me there. The bay horse stood in the stall on the north side of the cabin, patient and ready. The path south to Carrion Creek was 3 days and navigable even in moderate snow. I had $42 sewn into my coat lining and a practical nature and every reason in the world to ride down off that mountain and resume the life I'd been interrupted from. I stayed anyway. Every morning was a choice. That was something I understood clearly, and something Cord understood without my needing to say it. He never asked me to stay past the day I'd said I was staying, never assumed. Every morning, we simply both woke up still there, and that was the only agreement we needed. I learned the mountain the way you learn a language, in pieces first, then patterns, then all at once. I learned where the water ran fastest in early thaw, and which ridgeline sheltered the best firewood, and what the sky looked like an hour before a serious storm. I learned which wounds in the cabin's construction the wind found first, and how to pack them. I learned the mountain's moods the way you learn a person's. I also learned his. I learned that he woke from nightmares sometimes, not loudly, not with any of the drama that word implies, just a sudden stillness where there had been breathing, and then quiet for a long time after. I never said anything about it. I don't think he wanted that. But I learned the sound of it, and I learned how long it took for his breathing to settle, and I lay in the dark, counting the time, and eventually it always settled. I learned that he was capable of more gentleness than his appearance suggested, and less patience with dishonesty than his silence suggested. I learned that the Tennyson wasn't simply habit. He had passages memorized, certain ones he returned to the way you return to a window to look at a view. Come not when I am dead, to drop thy foolish tears upon my grave. I am sick of the palter of half-promises. I heard him say those lines once, quietly, when he thought I was asleep. I never told him I'd heard. I learned that he was, under everything else, a builder. He mended what was broken. He prepared for what was coming. He made things last. Not because anyone would see it or praise it, but because he was the kind of man who could not leave things worse than he found them. There was a morning in February when the snow was chest-deep outside and the light was very white through the small window, and we had been sitting over our coffee in the particular comfortable silence that had become the structure of our mornings, and he reached over and put his hand over mine on the table. Just for a moment. Just his hand over mine, warm and still and certain. I turned my hand over and held his. That was all. That was everything.